A black woman, dressed in a sleek business suit, arrived at the airport holding a first-class ticket, ready to board her flight. But just as she approached the gate, a flight crew member stopped her, eyeing her with suspicion. "This can't be right," the gate agent said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Despite presenting her ID and reservation, she was asked to step aside while others in line were allowed through without question. The woman remained calm, but what happened next changed everything. 7 minutes later, the truth about who she really was left the entire plane in silence, and the flight crew scrambling. This isn't just a story about a flight, it's about assumptions, power, and the moment the tables turn. Stick around, because the ending is one you won't see coming. Let me know where you're watching from. And if this resonates, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that matter. The hum of the airport was a familiar song, one of movement, expectation, and the quiet weight of lives in transit. Amina Jackson had long since learned how to navigate it. She moved through the terminal with the grace of someone who knew her destination intimately. But not so quickly that she seemed to chase after it. Her heels echoed sharply against the polished floor, each click announcing her presence to those who chose to notice. Few did. The gate loomed ahead, Gate 32 flickering in the overhead display like a neon omen. Amina adjusted the cuff of her blazer, the smooth fabric brushing her wrist like a silent assurance of the life she had built brick by brick. Degree by degree, and battle by battle, she had stood in courtrooms, under the gaze of men who underestimated her, and had left them silent with nothing but the weight of truth. But the arena changed depending on where you stood. In airports, no one asked for your title. They asked for your papers, your boarding pass, and sometimes, though rarely, outright proof that you belonged. As she approached the gate, her eyes caught the figure of Meredith Clark, the gate agent, tight bun, eyes like the blade of a knife, and a stance that spoke of authority worn like second skin. She was the kind of person Amina recognized immediately. Not because she knew her, but because she knew the type. Amina had met women like Meredith in grocery stores, at fundraisers, and seated across tables in high-rise offices. They smiled when necessary, but always with a twitch of hesitation, as if politeness were currency best saved for someone else. "Good afternoon," Amina greeted as she handed over her boarding pass. Her voice, smooth and measured, filled the space between them. Meredith barely glanced at her, but something in the moment stretched, brittle and tense. Amina saw it, the flicker of doubt that crossed Meredith's face as her eyes dropped to the first-class stamp at the corner of the ticket. "This doesn't look right," Meredith said, her voice loud enough to carry. It was a simple sentence, but Amina felt the prickle of eyes shift toward her. The businessman behind her shuffled impatiently. A family several feet away paused their conversation. Amina kept her smile, though she felt the familiar coiling of irritation beneath it. "It's valid. You can check the system if you like." Meredith didn't check. She held the boarding pass between two fingers, as if it were counterfeit. The gesture felt performative, deliberate. "We get a lot of these," Meredith said with a thin-lipped smirk. "People trying to sneak into first class." The words struck like a blade hidden beneath silk. Amina's posture didn't change. Years of weathering storms like this had taught her the value of stillness. She would not give Meredith the satisfaction of her indignation. "If you feel the need to call security," Amina replied, her tone even but sharp, "do so. I'm not moving from this line until I'm boarded." Meredith's eyes narrowed, but Amina saw the flicker of uncertainty there. Still, she was waved aside gently, politely, and just firmly enough to make the message clear. Amina stepped out of the line and stood to the side, her grip tightening on the handle of her bag. Now the eyes lingered. She watched as Meredith processed the next passenger. A white man in a rumpled suit stepped forward. His boarding pass was glanced at, barely held before he was waved through with a smile and nod. The small injustices were the most exhausting. They did not roar, they whispered. And in those whispers, they eroded something fundamental. Amina exhaled slowly, but her patience thinned with each passing minute. It wasn't long before two security officers arrived, their blue uniforms cutting through the crowd like a knife through fabric. "What seems to be the issue?" asked Officer Ryan, tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of authoritative stance Amina recognized. Meredith turned toward him with a practiced sense of urgency. "This passenger presented a suspicious ticket for first class. I thought it best to have someone verify." Suspicious. The word lingered, heavy in the air, but Amina met Ryan's eyes without hesitation. "I paid for that ticket. I have the receipt and identification to prove it." Ryan regarded her with careful scrutiny, but something in his gaze betrayed hesitation. Amina wasn't sure if he doubted Meredith or simply felt the awkwardness of standing in this moment. "May I see your ID, ma'am?" Amina handed over her driver's license and printed receipt. She said nothing as he inspected them, the seconds stretching long. Finally, he handed them back. "Everything checks out." Ryan's voice was calm, but his words unsettled the thin thread of control Meredith held over the situation. Meredith's face tightened. "It still seems unusual." She did not finish the thought. But she didn't need to. Unusual how? Amina could feel the implied question bleeding into the space between them. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, but his professionalism held. "If her documents are in order, she's free to board." Amina reached for her boarding pass, but Meredith's hand hovered over it a second longer than necessary before she released it. Amina smiled, but beneath that smile, she filed away every detail, every word, and the way Meredith's smirk faltered just before she stepped onto the plane. Amina Jackson did not sit down. She stood near the gate, just far enough to avoid blocking the line, but close enough to ensure her presence lingered like a shadow Meredith Clark could not ignore. There was power in stillness, and Amina wielded it with the patience of someone who understood that battles were rarely won in moments of fury, but in the quiet afterward when all eyes turned away. Still, her stillness did not shield her from the weight of the glances. The man who had shuffled past her in line now stood near the window, his gaze flicking to her every so often, as if trying to reconcile her polished exterior with the small scandal unfolding at Gate 32. A young woman in workout gear clutched her backpack tighter as she passed. Amina felt it all, the subtle readjustments of space, the tightening of invisible lines around her. No one said it aloud, but she heard them clearly. "You are out of place." It was not new. Years ago, it had been the high school counselor who insisted she aim for something more practical than law school. In college, it was the professor who told her that her writing, though impressive, lacked universal appeal. In courtrooms, it was the opposing counsel who consistently mistook her for an assistant, despite her name on the docket. And now, at Gate 32, it was a woman with a pinched smile and too much authority over who stepped forward and who was asked to wait. Amina glanced at her watch. The minutes crawled. Meredith processed the remaining passengers with a sudden lightness, her posture softening as the line dwindled. Her smiles grew wider, her small jokes at ease. She even lingered in brief conversations, handing back boarding passes with the warmth of an old friend. But each time Meredith's eyes flickered toward Amina, they hardened. Amina recognized the look for what it was: a performance for the audience, but a warning for her. "Stay where you are. Know your place." By the time the last few passengers filed onto the jet bridge, the waiting area had thinned. Amina remained, arms crossed, her boarding pass still tight between her fingers. Meredith, finished with her duties, began gathering papers at the counter. She didn't look up, but her words cut the air like glass. "The next flight boards in an hour. If you'd prefer to wait over there." "Ma'am, I'm sure the seating is more comfortable." Amina smiled softly, though the sharp edge behind it was unmistakable. "I'm quite comfortable here." A brief pause. Meredith's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. It wasn't a question of comfort. This, Amina knew, was about something deeper. Something that stretched beyond a seat assignment or an ID check. It was about small dominions. Little patches of power that people like Meredith held onto tightly, especially when faced with someone they believed shouldn't have them at all. Amina watched as Meredith made a call. Her back partially turned, though she couldn't hear the words. She could see the deliberate glance Meredith cast over her shoulder. The same security officer from earlier. Ryan returned a few moments later, now accompanied by a colleague. This one, shorter and younger, with the nervous energy of someone new to authority, stood a step behind him. Meredith's voice lifted with casual ease. "I just wanted to confirm everything was squared away." Ryan nodded, but his eyes betrayed him when they settled on Amina. He did not like being called back. Amina stepped forward. "Is there something else you need from me, officer?" Ryan hesitated, glancing at his colleague as if for reassurance. "No, ma'am, everything's fine." "Good," Amina said, "because I would hate to think I've become a security concern simply by standing here." Ryan shifted uncomfortably. His partner, still uncertain of the dynamics at play, remained silent. I apologize if there was any misunderstanding, Ryan offered, but his words stumbled over themselves. Hesitant and hollow. There's no misunderstanding, Amina replied calmly, but her eyes locked with Meredith's. Only clarity. For a long moment, Meredith said nothing. She held Amina's gaze, but it wasn't defiance that Amina saw reflected there. It was discomfort, the kind that only came when someone like Meredith found herself suddenly on the wrong side of an assumption she had made with absolute certainty. Amina let the silence stretch until Meredith broke it. You're free to board, ma'am. I know, Amina answered softly. And with that, she stepped forward, heels clicking deliberately against the tile as she crossed the threshold to the jet bridge. But she didn't forget. No one ever truly forgets the waiting space where you're not told you can't enter. But you're made to wait long enough that the message settles deep into your bones. The jet bridge was colder than Amina expected. It stretched long and narrow, the hum of the engines outside vibrating faintly beneath her heels. Amina walked slowly, not because she was hesitant, but because she knew the weight of eyes trailing her footsteps. There was something different about the way people watched you once you had been made to wait. To Meredith Clark, the moment at the gate had passed. It was a minor event, a misunderstanding to be brushed away with the sweep of procedural language. Amina knew better. Nothing lingered longer than an accusation left unresolved. It sat in the air, curling around every interaction that followed. As she stepped onto the plane, Amina felt the change immediately. The flight attendants' smiles were rehearsed, but beneath them flickered curiosity. The kind that asks silent questions. Who is she? What happened back there? Amina met their glances with calm certainty. As if to say, yes, you saw correctly. Her seat was near the front, second row in first class. She placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment with precise care, smoothing the corners of her blazer as she settled into the wide leather seat. The hum of conversation drifted from further down the aisle. But here, in first class, the atmosphere was quieter, cushioned by layers of politeness and the unspoken rule that discomfort should never be voiced too loudly. She could feel the eyes of the businessman across the aisle. He was middle-aged, with silver hair at his temples and the air of someone used to being listened to. Amina had seen men like him before, men who believed in fairness. But only after someone like her reminded them that unfairness existed. Glad you made it, he said, leaning in slightly, his voice low. Amina met his gaze. There was never a question that I would. He chuckled, though there was no humor in it. You handled that well. Well enough, Amina replied, though she didn't elaborate. She had long grown tired of being praised for composure in moments that should never have happened at all. The plane continued to board, and Amina let her head rest against the seat, closing her eyes for a brief moment. But even in the dim quiet, she could still hear Meredith's voice echoing in her mind. It still seems unusual. That was the nature of these moments. It was never about outright denial. It was about questions, small, carefully placed questions that forced you to explain yourself. They unraveled the quiet certainty you carried, making you justify what others had been granted freely. The plane's doors finally closed, and the captain's voice filled the cabin, announcing the duration of the flight. Amina barely registered the words. But then, excuse me, ma'am. Amina opened her eyes to find the lead flight attendant standing beside her seat. Her name tag read Laura Hastings, and her expression, though polite, carried the weight of something unsaid. Yes? I was asked to verify your boarding pass, Laura said, her voice just above a whisper. Amina's grip tightened on the armrest. Her eyes didn't flicker, didn't rise in question. Instead, she reached calmly into her bag, pulling out the pass Meredith had already scrutinized once. Laura examined it briefly, then offered a small, practiced smile. Thank you. I apologize for the inconvenience. Amina folded the pass, tucking it away without a word. Laura lingered, as if expecting some acknowledgement of the apology. But Amina's silence was deliberate, a reminder that not every slight could be smoothed over with politeness. The attendant withdrew. Across the aisle, the businessman frowned, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. They're not usually that persistent, he murmured. Amina arched a brow. Persistent is one word for it. He hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. I would have said something if they'd tried that with me. Amina met his gaze with quiet intensity. They wouldn't have tried. The man blinked, taken aback by the simple truth of it. There were no questions for him. No extra steps. No pauses to verify that he belonged. And that was the heart of it. It wasn't that Amina's ticket had been questioned. It was that the very idea of her being in this seat dressed as she was, speaking as she did, had unsettled something. That small sliver of doubt. Meredith's pause. Laura's second request. They were fragments of the same machine. A machine that didn't break apart loudly, but worked quietly, grinding down the edges of certainty piece by piece. The plane began its slow taxi down the runway. Amina let her eyes drift to the window, watching as the airport shrank behind her. It wasn't over. It was never over. But she had no intention of letting the silence swallow this moment whole. The plane had leveled at cruising altitude, but the cabin felt anything but steady. Amina Jackson sat upright, legs crossed, fingers laced lightly over her knee. But she wasn't reading the briefing on her tablet. The words drifted past her eyes without landing. Laura Hastings, the flight attendant, had returned to the galley. But Amina could still feel the lingering traces of the interaction. The weight of it sat in the seat beside her, quiet but present. Like an unwanted passenger no one had the courage to ask to leave. Across the aisle, the businessman, his name now revealed as Gregory Wells, shifted his focus back to his newspaper. But Amina saw the way his fingers drummed the armrest. He was troubled. Troubled not by what had happened to him, but by what he had witnessed happen to someone else. That, Amina thought, was often how it worked. It wasn't the injustice itself that disturbed people like Wells. It was proximity to it. The realization that fairness was a fragile currency, one that some could spend endlessly, while others, like her, had to fight to earn in small, begrudging increments. She was used to it. But used to it did not mean numb. As the flight moved forward, Amina's eyes traced the slow, methodical movements of the crew. Laura seemed to avoid her row now, making rounds at the back before looping forward as if the air around Amina's seat was thinner. And maybe it was. Moments like these had a way of drawing oxygen out of the room, replacing it with a quiet discomfort that everyone felt but refused to name. Amina leaned back slightly, letting the leather cushion her. But the sensation was fleeting. She was still waiting for the other shoe to drop, because it always did. And it wasn't long before it happened. A soft chime overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice drifted through the cabin, calm and precise. "We've received word of some moderate turbulence ahead. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." A ripple of mild concern passed through the rows. The faint sound of belts clicking filled the space. Amina secured hers and glanced out the window. The clouds, dark and rippled along the horizon, gathered like smoke. The businessman across the aisle exhaled, folding his paper. "I hope it's not one of those rough patches," he muttered to no one in particular. Amina offered a faint smile, though her thoughts lingered elsewhere. Turbulence didn't bother her. It wasn't the sky she was worried about. 15 minutes passed. The cabin was mostly quiet, save for the faint rattle of trays. Then, "Excuse me, Miss Jackson." The voice was low, hesitant. Amina looked up to find Officer Ryan, the security officer from the gate, standing just inside the first-class cabin. His presence felt out of place against the soft luxury of the rows. Like oil on silk. Amina's expression did not shift, though the air around her seemed to tighten. "Is there something I can help you with, officer?" she asked, her tone light but sharp around the edges. Ryan cleared his throat, uncomfortable beneath her gaze. "I'm sorry to disturb you during the flight. I was asked to follow up on a small matter regarding your identification." There it was. The other shoe. Amina kept her posture relaxed, though inside, she felt the quiet flicker of heat rising beneath her skin. "I believe we already settled this at the gate," she replied. Ryan shifted. "I understand, ma'am. I just wanted to confirm everything was in order. It won't take long." She glanced around the cabin. Passengers pretended not to listen, but their ears stretched invisibly toward the conversation. Gregory Wells frowned now, sitting up straighter. Amina's voice didn't rise, but the steel beneath it hardened. "Tell me, Officer Ryan," she began slowly, "how often do you follow passengers onto a plane to confirm their identification after they've already been cleared through security twice?" Ryan hesitated. "It's not standard, but we just wanted to be thorough." "Thorough?" Amina let the word hang between them. "Would you like to see my ID again?" she asked. though the question wasn't a question at all. Ryan looked as if he might answer, but then stopped, sensing the trap in her words. "No, ma'am, that won't be necessary." Amina smiled faintly, though no warmth accompanied it. "Good, then I'll assume we're done here." Ryan nodded, retreating quickly toward the exit. As he passed, Amina caught Gregory's eyes. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came, because what was there to say? Amina turned her attention back to the window, but the view beyond was swallowed by thick clouds now, obscuring the horizon. The plane trembled gently with the first waves of turbulence. Amina closed her eyes, letting the quiet hum of the engine settle into her. It wasn't the turbulence outside that concerned her. It was the storm that had followed her on board. The turbulence came in steady pulses, gentle at first, the kind that rocked passengers into a restless slumber. But Amina Jackson remained wide awake. She had closed her eyes. Yes, but closing your eyes and resting were two very different things. She listened to the steady drone of the engines, felt each shift of the plane beneath her like an old rhythm she'd long grown accustomed to. Her father used to say there was no silence more profound than the one you felt while suspended in the sky. But Amina had learned over the years that the world didn't stop making noise just because you'd left the ground. It followed you. And today, the noise had boarded right along with her. Across the aisle, Gregory Wells flipped through the in-flight magazine, but Amina could see the crease between his brows. His eyes weren't following the words on the page. Finally, he spoke without looking up. "What just happened?" Amina opened her eyes, turning to him with a calm she didn't entirely feel. "I imagine Officer Ryan was just being thorough," she said, her voice laced with quiet irony. Gregory set the magazine aside and leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I wasn't going to say anything earlier, but this is the second time they've stopped you. Isn't it?" Amina gave a small nod. Gregory hesitated, his discomfort palpable. "I just don't get it. You're obviously supposed to be here. First class. Professional. You don't exactly strike me as someone sneaking onto planes." There it was, the heart of it. Amina's lips curved into a faint smile. "You sound surprised." He blinked. "Well, yes, I mean, you thought you understood how this works." She interrupted softly. "But it doesn't. Not the way you imagined." Gregory sat back, frowning. "I thought we were past this. It's 2024. People are supposed to know better." Amina's gaze drifted toward the window. She watched as the clouds peeled away beneath them, revealing a pale blue sky stretched thin like paper. "I think," she said slowly, "that's exactly the problem. People believe we've crossed some invisible finish line. They assume the work is done. But it's not. It never is." Gregory's frown deepened. His was the kind of face that crinkled when confronted with things he didn't fully understand. "But that flight attendant apologized." He pressed, as if offering her proof of fairness. "And Ryan, he didn't push too hard. Surely that counts for something?" Amina turned to him fully now, her eyes locking onto his with the weight of someone who had lived through this conversation before. "Tell me something, Mr. Wells," she said, her voice low but steady. "If I hadn't been wearing this suit, if I hadn't been holding a first-class ticket, do you think I would have even made it this far?" Gregory opened his mouth to respond but found no words waiting. Amina continued, "You think the apology means something. But apologies are easy. They don't erase the fact that I was the only one questioned. Twice. And if I hadn't held my ground, do you honestly believe I'd be sitting here now?" He looked away, shifting in his seat. "I guess not," he admitted finally. Amina softened, just slightly. She didn't fault him for his hesitation. This was how most people moved through the world, not with malice, but with blinders. Gregory cleared his throat. "It's strange, isn't it?" he mused quietly. "To build a life, work hard, succeed, and still have to prove you deserve the seat you've already paid for." Amina's smile returned, thin but sharp. "Strange isn't the word I would use." The plane jolted suddenly, knocking the edge of her glass of water. Amina caught it swiftly, steadying the cup before it could spill. Gregory let out a nervous chuckle. "Maybe I should have had that second bourbon after all," he muttered. Amina didn't reply. Her mind had already drifted elsewhere, back to the gate. Back to Meredith Clark's skeptical gaze. She thought of all the Meredith Clarks she'd met in her life. The teachers who told her she was bright for someone like you. The colleagues who forgot to CC her in emails. The clients who assumed the younger white associate was the attorney in charge, even when Amina was the one standing at the head of the table. It was never overt. That was the trick of it. Subtle enough to deny, sharp enough to cut. She leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. "Mr. Wells," she said without turning her head. If you really thought we were past this, then why did you feel the need to speak up back at the gate?" Gregory froze, his hand hovering over his glass. Amina let the silence fill the space between them. People always knew the truth. The problem was they didn't like saying it out loud. The seatbelt sign flickered off with a soft chime. But Amina Jackson didn't move. Gregory Wells shifted in his seat beside her, stretching his legs, but Amina remained perfectly still. The plane's gentle hum filled the cabin, but it was the silence around her that carried the most weight. She could feel it, the unspoken tension resting on the shoulders of the passengers around her. No one said it aloud, but they all knew. They had watched as Officer Ryan lingered too long at her seat. Watched as the flight attendant avoided her gaze afterward. Watched as Amina smiled, polite and composed, though the heat simmered beneath her skin. And they had said nothing. Gregory's voice finally broke the silence. "I suppose I spoke up because..." He paused, searching for words that didn't seem to come easily. "Because it felt wrong." Amina turned her head slightly, catching his eyes. "It felt wrong," she echoed, her tone even but sharp at the edges. "But not wrong enough to stop it." Gregory shifted again, crossing one ankle over the other, his discomfort settling in deeper. "I thought about it. Back at the gate, I almost said something. But you didn't," Amina replied softly. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Amina leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. "I don't blame you," she said. "It's easier not to get involved. I've seen it happen my entire life. The looks, the glances, the quiet shifting of weight from one foot to the other. As if saying something would tip the balance too far." Gregory frowned. "I wanted to believe she was just following procedure." Amina laughed, not bitterly, but in that low, known way that felt heavier than anger. "You can dress it up however you like," she said, "but at the end of the day, you recognized it for what it was. You didn't need someone to explain it to you." Gregory's gaze dropped to the empty glass on his tray table. Amina studied him for a moment. The lines creased around his eyes, the graying hair at his temples. He had the look of a man who had lived long enough to witness the world shift, but not so much that he had fully reckoned with how little it had changed. After a long pause, he spoke again. "You're right," he admitted. "I knew." Amina didn't respond. She didn't need to. The admission hung between them like fog, heavy and undeniable. Gregory rubbed his hands together as if brushing away invisible dust. "You know," he said, his voice quieter now, "when I was younger, I thought things like this were louder. I thought racism looked like people shouting in the streets, signs on water fountains, and politicians arguing on television." Amina's eyes softened, but her expression didn't change. "It was loud once," she said, "but over time, it learned how to whisper." Gregory looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something shift behind his eyes. "Those whispers," Amina continued, "are what exhaust people like me. They don't scream at you. They don't slam the door in your face. They just ask you to wait, to explain, to justify, and they do it with a smile." Gregory sighed, leaning back into his seat as if the weight of those words pressed him down. "I can't imagine what that feels like." Amina smiled faintly. "You don't have to imagine it. You saw it happen right in front of you." Gregory's face flushed slightly, but he didn't look away. There was something almost admirable in that. The fact that he sat with the discomfort instead of running from it. Amina shifted, turning her gaze back to the window. "You know," she said after a long pause, "the most dangerous thing about that gate agent wasn't that she questioned my ticket." Gregory glanced at her, waiting. It was that she believed she had the right to question it. Amina said softly, and no one in that line thought to challenge her. Gregory opened his mouth, but no words came. They didn't need to. They both knew the cost of quiet. And the plane soared on, carving through the clouds, leaving no trace of the conversation behind. The plane drifted forward, slicing through clouds that stretched endlessly. Soft and indifferent, Amina Jackson sat with her back straight, eyes fixed on the darkening horizon beyond the window. The sunlight had shifted now, casting long shadows across the cabin. as if the day itself was retreating from the weight of what lingered in the air. Gregory Wells sat across the aisle, but he hadn't spoken since their last exchange. He fiddled with the corner of his armrest, occasionally glancing in Amina's direction as if waiting for a signal, some small gesture that might release him from the gravity of the moment. But Amina gave him nothing. She didn't owe him that. A flight attendant passed, pouring water with careful, silent precision. Her eyes skimmed over Amina's row but didn't stop. That was part of it too. In moments like these, people often pretended not to see. Amina could feel the weight of their discomfort, passengers buried in their books, eyes glued to in-flight screens, suddenly interested in magazines they hadn't touched the entire flight. It wasn't guilt. Not exactly. It was something quieter, something that lingered at the edges of their lives, unspoken but fully known. The same passengers who had watched her at the gate were here now, pretending the incident had evaporated the moment the plane left the tarmac. But it hadn't. It sat there, tucked between the overhead bins and the hushed conversations. Gregory broke first. I think, he hesitated. Starting over. I think people like me, we assume things will fix themselves. Amina turned slightly toward him, one brow arching. Fix themselves? Gregory's fingers drummed once against his knee. Yes, I suppose I thought if we stayed quiet long enough, progress would just happen, without all the discomfort. Amina leaned forward slightly, resting her elbow against the armrest. Her eyes pinned him with the quiet, deliberate weight that years in courtrooms had taught her to sharpen like a blade. You think injustice fades if you simply look away from it long enough? She asked, her tone calm but firm. Gregory's gaze faltered. I suppose that's what I hoped. Amina let the silence stretch, letting him feel it fully. She said slowly, the people who built this country, people like me, didn't have the luxury of hoping for change. We had to demand it. And when no one listened, we had to build it with our own hands. Gregory nodded, though his eyes held the quiet unease of someone realizing how deeply he had misunderstood the foundation beneath his feet. I guess I thought things were different now, he admitted. I thought we were further along. Amina studied him for a long moment. Further along than what? She asked softly. Than fire hoses and protests on the evening news? Gregory hesitated. Racism isn't something you bury. Amina continued, her voice unwavering. It shifts. It learns. It moves from the streets into boardrooms. From front doors to job applications. From courtrooms to airport gates. And if you're not paying attention, it'll slip right past you, dressed in something that looks almost harmless. Gregory let out a long breath, leaning back into his seat. He rubbed his face with both hands, as if trying to wipe away something that refused to leave. I don't know how to fix that, he admitted. Amina's eyes softened slightly, though the steel beneath them remained. It's not about fixing, she said. It's about refusing to be silent when you see it happening. Gregory nodded, but Amina could tell the weight of her words was still settling in. The way truth often did, slowly and uncomfortably. He shifted in his seat, looking out the window. I guess I just thought people would know better by now, he muttered. Amina's gaze remained steady. They do, she said quietly. They just hope they won't have to be the ones to say it out loud. Gregory didn't respond right away. His silence felt heavier now, no longer passive but contemplative, like a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't quite name. And Amina let him stand there. Because reckoning doesn't come gently. It comes in the quiet moments, in the cracks of conversation where denial no longer fits. As the plane sailed forward, Amina let herself breathe deep and full, feeling the truth settle between them like an uneasy truce. And the world outside the window stretched on, just as indifferent as before. The plane began its slow descent, the distant city lights flickering beneath the clouds like stars scattered across the ground. Amina Jackson felt the slight shift as the aircraft dipped, but her gaze remained fixed ahead, past Gregory Wells, past the quiet hum of the cabin. She had spent her life moving forward, never lingering too long on moments like the one at Gate 32. Yet never letting them slip from memory either. Gregory hadn't spoken in nearly 20 minutes. There was a strange heaviness in the air between them, but Amina recognized it for what it was. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't shame. It was the weight of knowing the first crack in the smooth surface of the world Gregory thought he understood. Amina had seen that look before. It was the look of a man realizing that the floor beneath him had been uneven all along. The captain's voice drifted over the speakers. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Amina glanced out the window. The airport glowing in the distance. Gregory shifted beside her, clearing his throat. Can I ask you something? Amina turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. You can ask. He hesitated. Why didn't you push harder back at the gate? I mean, if it had been me, I think I would have made a scene. Amina smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. I've made scenes before, she said simply, but you learn over time when to raise your voice and when silence cuts deeper. Gregory tilted his head, considering her words. Scenes, Amina continued, make people uncomfortable, but silence makes them wonder. Gregory nodded slowly, his fingers tracing absent patterns on the edge of his tray table. I guess I just thought justice meant being louder. Justice, Amina said, her voice low but firm, isn't about being louder. It's about enduring until those who refuse to listen have no choice but to hear you. The plane dipped lower, and the runway stretched out before them, long and unyielding. Gregory sat back, watching the airport grow larger in the window's reflection. You know, he said, almost to himself, I'm going to remember this flight for a long time. Amina turned toward him fully now. Her eyes softened, but there was still something unshaken beneath them, something Gregory couldn't quite name. I hope you do, she said, but remembering isn't enough. Gregory met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something settle there, a quiet acknowledgement that hadn't been present before. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, and the engines roared as the plane slowed, the runway lights blurring past. Passengers began to stir, reaching for bags and jackets. Gregory stood first, pulling his suitcase from the overhead compartment. But before he turned to leave, he paused, his eyes meeting Amina's once more. I don't know if I said it earlier. He began carefully, but I'm sorry for what happened at the gate. Amina offered him a small, knowing smile. You didn't have to say it. I already knew. Gregory nodded, lingering for a moment longer before stepping into the aisle. Amina waited. She had no desire to rush. By the time she stepped onto the jet bridge, most of the passengers had already scattered into the terminal, their lives folding seamlessly back into the hum of the world. But standing just beyond the exit was Meredith Clark, the gate agent. Her posture was stiff, as if she had been waiting deliberately. But her eyes betrayed the uncertainty lurking just beneath her carefully composed expression. Amina met her gaze and held it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Meredith shifted, opening her mouth as if to say something, perhaps another apology. Or maybe an excuse, but Amina raised a hand gently, stopping her before the words could form. Don't apologize, Amina said, her voice soft but unmistakable. It's not for me to correct you. Meredith swallowed, her eyes flickering with something that looked almost like relief, though not the kind that brought comfort. Amina's gaze lingered for just a second longer before she stepped past her, heels clicking softly against the terminal floor. She didn't look back. There was no need. Amina knew Meredith would remember her. But whether Meredith chose to change, that was a question only time would answer.